Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Dawn Evans from Sourcing Interest Group, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our webinar series. So just a few housekeeping items to go through, and then we'll jump into the content, because I know that it's going to be a fabulous webinar. We have over 700, close to 800 people registered for today, so let me get on with the background stuff. We have a members reward program that we launched this year. We're going to be rolling it out at the SIG Summit in October. You'll be able to redeem your reward points for prizes. So anytime you either attend an event like a webinar, if you want to dial into a webinar, speak at an event, donate to the SRC, etc., there are points that will be allocated to you. So we'll be sharing more about that very shortly.
Yeah.
Also, some of the SIG member benefits. We have 4 member benefits that are 100% allocated to you as a member of SIG. Please save this slide. Make sure you click on the URL at the bottom of it and go in and see the things that our members are offering to our other members at either a very steep discount or for free. So great member benefits that we now have available to you. Also, the Career Network. We are adding probably 4 to 8 new jobs a day. Some recent postings on the right-hand side. Please, if you have a job within your organization that you'd like to get filled, we have about 20,000 active people in sourcing and outsourcing that come to our site on a daily basis. We'd love to have your job postings. We'd love to help you fill those positions. And also new to the Career Network is our internship program. If you guys are hiring interns, please post your internship on our site. We are now partnering with a number of master's programs in supply chain, and we have a bunch of students that are coming to the site now to look for internships. Also, the webinar series is every Tuesday and Thursday. The next one is going to be Solving the Reshoring Dilemma, brought to you by A.T. Kearney, followed up, again, with Zycus, and this is going to be a solution deep dive. So when you're going to hear a lot of great things from Zycus today, but going to the deep dive, you're really going to learn everything Zycus has to offer. So I encourage you to show up for the Zycus deep dive on September 4th. And then September 16th, we have Sourcing the Large Enterprise Way, Best Practices for Any Organization, and that's presented by Mira Brown, and they always bring us fabulous presenters. Also, we have our town hall teleconferences. For those of you who aren't aware of what those are, that is buy-side only attendees in an open mic facilitated conversation about a topic. Buy-side only, open mic, not recorded, so no one can ever play back what you said and what you heard on that webinar, or the town hall teleconference, excuse me. Next one coming up is September 10th. These are once a month at 1 p.m. Eastern. And the next one coming up is going to be Designing a Meaningful Set of Procurement Metrics for Every Contract. And I actually am going to be presenting the content for that one, so I hope to see you there on our Town Hall teleconference. Also, we take SIG out to our members. We have 3 upcoming symposiums, and the symposium, if you think of it like a mini summit, jam-packed day, morning, afternoon, into evening. It has general sessions, it has panels, it has breakouts. Very big day, about 100 people in attendance, and I'll be in Columbus on September 24th, so I hope to see you there. And then we have New York, October 29th, and San Francisco Bay Area, November 12th. So if you have colleagues in any of these cities or in those locations, please let them know that they should be attending the symposium. Also, we have regional roundtables, and these are slightly smaller events, about 50 people in attendance, and the next one's going to be in Orange County on November 14th. You can register for all of these events at sig.org. And then I'm so excited, our Global Summit is coming up in Denver, Colorado at the gorgeous Omni Interlaken Hotel. Completely non-commercialized event. No exhibit hall, no tchotchkes, nobody's going to sell to you. It will be non-commercial. It's going to be about thought leadership and networking. About 70% of the audience will be on the buy side. And just look at some of the global brands across the bottom that are going to be there. 3 days of networking. So we're going to have CPO roundtables on Tuesday. We have entertainment and amazing things for you to do Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And we're ready. We have about 50 breakout sessions that we're building out on our site right now. One other housekeeping item. Lower right-hand corner of your screen, you should have an orange question mark. If you would do me a favor and click on that now and keep that open, if something comes up during today's conversation you'd like to interject with a question, send it to me, and I will try and interject. We have 2 amazing speakers with us today. They have promised if we don't get to your questions, they will follow up with you after today's webinar. So keep the questions coming. And what we ask our presenters to do is to actually write up the question, write up the answer so we can send it to all of you. So any questions that we don't get to today, we will try and get out to you very shortly, and our presenters have promised to follow up with you. You'll also get their contact information on the very last slide, so you want to download this deck at the end of the webinar, save it to your hard drive, and then you'll have a way to reach both of the presenters today and carry the conversation and keep it going. And of course, I'd be amiss to say, Zycus, of course, will be presenting at the upcoming summit, so you'll have a chance to meet them in person as well if you join us in Denver. So with that, I am so excited. These guys are both fabulous. They're just wonderful. So I'm going to start with Richard. He's the Vice President Corporate Development at Zycus. He started his career as a marketing and finance manager with GE, and over the years he's evolved into a business leader and entrepreneur where he helped launch the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement, as well as co-founding one of the first SaaS, software as a service source suite providers. He's great. He's been with Zycus now for a while, and we look forward to hearing him speak today about procurement metrics that really matter. With him is Patrick Connaughton, from Senior Research Director at Hackett Group, and Hackett Group is also another wonderful member of SIG. He has worked on multiple projects that range from presenting in front of customers to an in-depth analysis of a segment of the supply chain market. He has approximately 7 years of research experience working for both Forrester and the Hackett Group, and then consulting experience stemming from his years with Accenture. Patrick holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Sciences from the University of Florida. So we have two guys that really know their stuff. So I'm so pleased to welcome both Hackett Group and Zycus, and thank you, Richard, for bringing Hackett Group and such a great presentation to us today. You guys are amazing. So with that, I'm going to hand over the controls, and you guys can take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Don. This is Richard Waugh from Zycus. We're pleased to be bringing you this webinar today, Analyze This, the Procurement Metrics That Matter. So we kind of stole the title, Analyze This, for those who remember the movie several years ago with Robert De Niro and Billy Crystal. So you see Patrick and I here, we'll leave it to you to decide who's going to be played by De Niro and who's played by Billy Crystal. But we will join forces to take you through these top 10 metrics that matter. Real quickly, just to set the stage here, Zycus is a provider of an integrated source-to-pay suite of technology solutions. Our focus today won't be on technology, but just to set the context, as we go through, we'll also be trying to highlight where enabling technology can help to produce reliable and consistent metrics that matter for your organizations. So, without further ado, I'll walk through the agenda for today. It is a top 10, and in David Letterman fashion, we chose to go in reverse order here. A little bit more dramatic if we had revealed them one at a time, like Letterman, and certainly would be more humorous in the Letterman vein. But nevertheless, these are our top 10 metrics. And first, we expect a healthy amount of debate, and in fact, welcome that. So we'll actually be asking you later on in one of our poll questions to weigh in on what would your top number one metric be. But a few other caveats about how this list was compiled. First of all, it's really a mix of traditional measures and what I would say are some of the emergent metrics that are starting to gain more traction and relevance of late. We focused on the top-level metrics, those that should be on every CPO's dashboard, if you will, but recognize that more detailed underlying metrics have to support each of these to establish root cause. The way we came up with the rankings, it considered both the importance and current overall market adoption, but we thoroughly expect that due to varying factors for each individual organization, their level of maturity, their specific business needs, that the relative ranking might change. We also expect the list to be dynamic, so that some of these emerging metrics we fully expect should gain greater importance and, in fact, supplant some of the more traditional metrics at the top of the list. So with that being said, we're going in reverse order here. We're going to start with, number 10 is actually what we call the Net Promoter Score, so more of an internal customer satisfaction metric. Number 9, incremental revenue derived from supplier innovation. This is one of those key emerging metrics that hit our chart with a bullet, if you will. And it's ways of finding new value on the top line through procurement-led collaboration initiatives. Number 8, a measure of supplier consolidation or potentially fragmentation, but opportunities to leverage the spend by driving more of it to a fewer fewer suppliers that would account for 80% of the total spend. Number 7, measure the resource allocation. Are the right people doing the right things? Number 6, procurement ROI, a way to justify continued or perhaps additional investment in the procurement organization based on the returns it can deliver. Number 5, realized implemented savings. So the time-tested, one of those traditional measures, certainly has to be on the list here, but we'll identify areas where, that metric is kind of changing in importance, and also highlight the fact that this realized and implemented is a much tougher standard to meet than simply identified or potential savings. Number 4, we look at the cost of procurement as a percent of spend, and Patrick is going to highlight the fact that world-class performers are actually spending less to save more. Number 3, procurement contract compliance, so the critical link to turn those negotiated or identified potential savings into realized implemented savings. Number 2, our spend with line item visibility. We see this as a foundational capability to analyze spend at the most granular level to make it actionable. And number 1, spend under management, kind of the starting point for procurement to be able to contribute value is having the visibility and actually control over what's being spent. So that's our top 10. And what we're going to do, again, in a tag team fashion, is kind of go through these, and now we're going to reverse the order and start with number 1, spend under management. And this was probably the most common metric, but in some cases somewhat misunderstood or perhaps misapplied. And Patrick is going to lead us off actually with several different nuances, different ways to look at spend under management. So Patrick, let me turn that over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Richard. And thanks, Zycus and Big Group, for having me as a guest today. I'm excited to be able to talk about some of these things. As the research director at the Hackett Group, metrics are at our core, and so this is something that we really enjoy talking about. Now, spend under management. This is one of those things where there can be some gray area between the different ways that it's defined. And what you can see in this diagram here is at the very core, you have spend sourced directly by procurement professionals. So this is the actual spend that procurement folks are involved in the supplier selection and pricing for. And you'll see some percentages on here. And at Hackett, we talk about world-class and non-world-class. So world-class companies are defined by effectiveness and efficiency, and we have a number of metrics that we use in our benchmarks to break those out. And so what the percentages represent is that 85% at world-class companies, 85% of spend falls into this sourced directly by procurement category. The rest of the world is around 66%. And so we use this as a measure of really the reach that the procurement organization has. Now, it's important to differentiate between spend sourced and spend influenced. And so we start off by spend that's directly sourced by procurement, but then we move into this second category where maybe it wasn't directly sourced, but it was influenced by a formal and documented strategy. So the team has created category plans, and they've been applied in the selection and sourcing of this spend. And then the next level is spend influenced. So this is really even a little bit of a grayer area where you get out of directly sourced, you get out of maybe using a category plan that's been directly applied, and you move into this area where spend influence really refers to the spend that procurement has some influence over, whether it's a policy, whether it was purchased in the context of the procurement rules and processes. But again, this is at a much higher level. And I think it's important to really differentiate between spend influence and spend sourced directly. And so that's when Richard was alluding to, and there being different ways to really slice this. Total spend, really that's the size of the prize. So that's all of the cost of direct and indirect materials that's being purchased. So again, this is an important metric that we use, and we usually use it to establish a baseline to see where we're at, to get a real sense of what the opportunity might be to start to bring more of this spend under control. This is really the best place to start. Richard?
Thanks very much, Patrick. So just to follow on further and look at kind of the traditional definition of spend under management, and essentially that being sourceable spend that is actively controlled by the procurement function. We think this most standard metric, I guess, if you will especially be helpful if the goal is to benchmark your organization's performance against either the overall market or maybe even of more relevance, your particular industry. So with the definition in place here that there is clear responsibility for sourcing the category, that corporate agreements are in place with preferred or at least approved suppliers, and recognizing that 100% spend under management is at best a theoretical standard, nevertheless, the top-performing organizations are able to account for the vast majority of corporate spending as managed spend. And spend under management is number one on our list, really because visibility and control over its spending is a prerequisite to all other areas of procurement performance. So, simply put, less spend under management means less opportunity to build a savings pipeline, to drive supplier innovation, or manage risk effectively. Looking at some other benchmarks, we rely heavily on Hackett, obviously, but we'll incorporate some others as we go along here. Some from Aberdeen Group, for example, suggest that best-in-class companies are achieving 80% spend under management, average performers only 62%, and the laggards bringing up the rear at only 22%. So as we go through each of these metrics, we also wanted to highlight for you, in addition to the benchmarks, the targets that you're setting, what's the calculation methodology, what are some key value levers as well as technology enablers to help accomplish and support these metrics, as well as a few caveats or cautions to mention along the way. So, our calculation, of course, would look at the total spend but include non-discretionary or non-sourceable spend. Taxes might be a great example here that you wouldn't include. Key technology enablers, first, of course, spend analytics to help identify where those savings opportunities exist, and also sourcing to be able to employ category management methodologies and execute on those opportunities. So a couple of the caveats. Spend under management does not equal savings. Category management and sourcing methodologies have to be executed effectively to first identify negotiated savings, and then the compliance processes have to be in place to realize those negotiated savings that actually get implemented and impact the financial statements. As mentioned earlier, 100% spend under management is likely not the goal. There are some tail spend categories that probably don't justify sourcing attention, and even some strategic categories that may not be appropriate for sourcing control. So a Zycus client, for example, a leader in the winemaking industry, related to us a very relevant example here where, actually the key ingredient, the key direct material to making wine, grapes, they decided for strategic reasons that's best managed by the domain experts, not procurement. So they actually exclude a major spend category from what's being targeted for spend under management, make sure that we get the best grapes. So those of us who like to consume the fruit of the vine are thankful for that. The other caveat here, spend under management benchmarks can vary widely by industry. So you see some of the selected benchmarks listed below. Take, for example, an industry like aerospace and defense, where government mandate and regulation like federal acquisition regulations actually govern procurement control, mandate that as part of the process. So spend under management is very high, 93%, whereas in an industry like financial services, there's been less of a history of being able to address certain categories, and spend under management is about 30 points lower, less than 64%.
So before
moving on,
I have a couple of clarification questions. And it said when you say managed by procurement, what does that include above and beyond the contract? Is it the quarterly business reviews, the service level agreements, scorecards, et cetera, or is it only through the contract stage?
Yeah, Patrick, I'll weigh in and let you comment as well, but we're typically talking about mainly a category management focus, that there's a category manager responsible for that particular category of spend, developing the strategy, negotiating the agreement. They may or may not have full life cycle responsibility for post-negotiation supplier management and business reviews. Patrick, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's how Hackett looks at it as well. Now, that's not to say that the downstream performance management and other activities isn't important. It's just when we look at spend under management, it's really for the purpose of understanding what percentage of spend has gone through that rigorous process up front of pricing and negotiation and selection.
Okay. And then also, regarding the spend under management, have you also benchmarked the federal government spend comparatively, or is this more of a public type view of spend under management?
Richard, you had different industries. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Patrick. I was just going to mention I have seen, and there are available benchmarks for the federal government. It's going to be similar to what I mentioned for defense-related industries that follow a number of the same guidelines. It's very high, essentially, because of the governing law that mandates a certain procurement process and procedure be followed, certainly for purchases over a very minimal dollar threshold.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Great, absolutely. And so moving on with metric number 2, we're going to talk about spend with line item visibility. So spend under management is the foundation upon which, procurement starts with. Visibility to accurately classified spend data at a granular line item level is really the best leading indicator of how effective the organization is likely to be in actually managing the spend. And when we talk about granular visibility, it's that 3 or 4 digit kind of UNSPSC class or commodity level as opposed to a higher level, let's say the family or segment only. So it's meaningful insight into spend to be able to execute from a sourcing standpoint. And as we look at the data here, the correlation between an organization's ability to analyze spend at this detailed level and the likelihood that they achieve world-class performance is really difficult to refute. So here with the benefit of Hackett's data, 89% of world-class procurement teams have that significant visibility across all spending at a very granular level as compared to just 42% for the peer group overall. And as you can see, better spend visibility correlates directly to very tangible results. So when you have significant visibility, the spend cost reduction achievement is almost 21% higher than if it's none or limited. And there's a more effective supplier rationalization strategy that can be implemented. So here, a third fewer suppliers per billion of spend. When it comes to the calculation, we focus on line item level spend classified as a percent of the total spend. And here the yardstick for top performance should be to achieve 90% or better granular line item level visibility. So from a technology standpoint, that's pretty obvious. A rigorous spend analytics is the critical enabler for producing accurate and timely spend information. So for instance, spend refreshes at least quarterly if the focus is to identify and execute sourcing savings opportunities, monthly or maybe more frequently if the focus is to track compliance. And as with most metrics here, the caveat is focus on getting it right for the 90% that matters the most, and don't sweat or invest sweat equity getting the last 10% of tail spend that probably doesn't drive decision-making anyway. Continuing on, number 3, procurement contract compliance. This directly addresses the ability to control not just how the goods and services are sourced, as is the case with spend under management, but actually how they're purchased by end users in the business. So the difference between spend under management that's centrally sourced and contracted and what actually gets ordered off of those approved agreements would represent contract leakage and therefore savings leakage. So here we'll look at some averaging benchmarks again. Best in class experience very little leakage, so 78% procurement contract compliance as compared to roughly 80% spend under management. But the drop-off is pretty precipitous for the others. So average performers, about a third leakage, just 30% of 62% spend under management that's compliant with procurement contracts, and at the bottom end, just 11% compliance. So here our calculation is based on actual spend, that is the actual invoices paid against contracts with approved suppliers as a percentage of the total managed spend. From a technology standpoint, really effective procurement contract compliance is going to utilize all the tools in the technology toolkit because it must engage business owners and end users around tools like procure-to-pay, contract management, for example, to really achieve the actual compliance. It's not enough just to focus on negotiating the best agreements, but it's making sure that they're implemented and that users comply with those agreements. One other last caveat, it's also not enough to measure just internal compliance, the fact that users are buying off those approved agreements, but also that suppliers are complying with contracted pricing and terms when users do access those contracts. And for number 4, I'd like to turn it back to Patrick to talk about the cost of procurement as a percent of spend. What's being invested in the procurement organization to then deliver the returns that you're targeting?
So, gentlemen, before you go to the next metric, a question came in and it said there was a global survey of procurement functions about 2 years ago, and it said procurement influences less than 60% of the spend across both direct and indirect categories. Is that true today, or has that number risen?
Well, Don, the Hackett benchmark shows that number as being higher than that, and we segmented into world-class and non-world-class. The non-world-class numbers are closer to 60%.
And world-class is upward up to about 85%, is that correct?
It ranges, between 85 to even upwards to 90%.
Okay, and then also, is there a difference in percentages for indirect spend under management or the rest of the supply chain part of the organization? Is indirect more highly managed or influenced, or direct materials as well?
So, my experience has been that indirect is actually not as well managed as direct. That there's a much greater opportunity to start to understand and influence a lot of the indirect categories, whereas the direct spend it's been pretty rigorously controlled for a very long time, right? So that's been my experience. I don't have the numbers handy on direct versus indirect spend influence, but I would expect that indirect would be much lower, actually.
I think I agree with you also. Okay, so let's go on to metric number 4, and thank you for your clarifications.
Sure. And I would make another point on the previous slide that Richard was talking about. The idea of contract compliance is important. In our benchmark, we actually ask companies, what do you lose in terms of negotiated savings when there's an average spend? And so companies come back and say that on average, it's between 7 and 8% of the negotiated savings that's lost when it's a non-compliant spend, when it's outside of the influence, when it's outside of the contract or the agreed upon pricing. That's a pretty significant number that I think really is important to track in addition to the compliance levels. Is what are you losing? What's being left on the table? In terms of the cost of procurement as a percentage of spend, so this is a very traditional metric that we track and a lot of companies track. It includes labor, outsourcing, technology costs for running the procurement organization itself. And here you can see on the metric that was included, on the right-hand side, you have the Hackett world-class metric, which represents about 0.6% of the overall spend as the cost of procurement. And this is a great presentation because what Zycus has done is they've pulled together different benchmarks from different organizations. So you can see the CAPS benchmark, you can see the other benchmarks. And I think that's a great reference point for the folks on the phone. Now, one of the key things that I would say about the cost of procurement is that for world-class organizations, we track this over a significant time horizon. So we look back to, say, 2000 to 2005, and then we forecast it out to 2018, 2020. And what we're seeing is a pretty significant leveling off of the cost of procurement. Both world-class and peer organizations have gotten to a point where they've taken a tremendous amount of cost out of the procurement organization. And for world-class companies that are operating at 0.60 as a percent of total spend, these organizations are actually running really, really lean. And so as we look at how are we going to drive different kinds of value, how are we going to look beyond just the basics of lowering our costs, I expect that the cost of procurement may actually start to rise a little bit over the next couple of years as companies look to invest more to drive new value. And so while this is an important metric, I think across the board, a lot of companies have really reached a point where they've taken as much out of their own internal costs as they can. And it's time to take a hard look at whether some investment is required to really take procurement to the next level. So again, very important metric, but we do see it starting to level up for a lot of these procurement organizations. Now that's not to say there's not a difference between what we call world-class and what we call peer or the rest of the world. We see a 19% difference in the cost of procurement between world-class and the rest of the world or peer. And so there is room to improve for the peer organizations. It's just something that I think it's important to focus on all of these areas we're talking about, not just on reducing costs. Next slide, please, Richard.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that point, we're going to have Dawn invite our audience in for a poll question here on what's going on out there in terms of the cost of the procurement organization overall and the ability to generate savings.
So, folks, in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you should have just seen the poll question pop open. If you don't, then click the sideways arrow and point it down, and it will open up for you on the right-hand side. So which of the following statements is most true about your current procurement organization? A, cost of procurement is declining, realized savings declining. Cost of procurement declining, realized savings flat or increasing. Cost of procurement flat or increasing, realized savings declining, or cost of procurement flat or increasing, realized savings flat or increasing. So I know this is going to take you a minute to think through all four, so I'll be quiet while you think, and then hit submit as soon as you choose your answer. Okay, the poll is now closed. It'll take just a few seconds for us to populate the answers. And just for those who've been asking, yes, we are going to push the slide deck at the end of today's presentation, and you'll be able to click on the link and download it as a PDF directly to your hard drive. We also sent it out with the 10-minute warning, and you should have it in your inbox as well. But either way, you should be able to get a copy. So, D, 51%. Cost of procurement flat or increasing, realized savings flat or increasing. Are you surprised it's 51% there, you guys?
I am. It's so the cost of procurement flat or increasing. That makes sense. Based on what we've seen, it's flat or maybe decreasing a little. Realized savings flat or increasing is actually a little different than what we're seeing out there. And we'll talk a little bit about that in some of the subsequent slides. But I am a little surprised to see that people are still able to drive more savings than they have over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at B and D, they're both realizing the realized savings are flat or increasing. So interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that does lead in to the next one, Patrick. I'll let you talk about metric number 5, realized and implemented savings, and maybe highlight where you see some pressures, I think particularly for more mature organizations on being able to repeat consistently savings that have been achieved historically.
Right. So what we're looking at here are total spend cost savings. And spend cost savings includes both reduction and avoidance. And this is as a percent of total annual spend. And it's over a pretty long time horizon. So we've tracked this for a while, starting in 2005 and kind of taking us through the recession in 2009 to 2012. And what you can see here is that in 2011, really, in the heat of the recession, spend savings were actually at their best. I think the recession had that effect where companies were able to drive a harder bargain. They were able to get a lot more leverage with suppliers, and essentially drive greater savings throughout that, both in reduction and in avoidance. If a supplier came to you during this time, which was a very difficult time, and said, we're going to increase your technology maintenance fees by 6% next year. Well, given the economy, given the state of the business, companies were able to avoid that cost by fighting back. So I think, the interesting dynamic here is that you look at the curve from 2009, where it was about 4.8% of total annual spend for world-class companies, rising up to 7.68% in 2011, so this is spend cost savings, and then into 2014 starting to trickle down again to 5.34, almost to that level that we saw pre-recession. And so our take is that companies are really starting to, these numbers were inflated because of the recession, and now as we move out of the recession, the economy improves, that it's more difficult to drive these savings. And so that's what these numbers tell us. The green bar, that represents the rest of the world, so peer organizations or other organizations. And you can see that these organizations are driving between 2 and 3% savings, as a result of their procurement efforts. So I think this is a great reference point for folks to understand where they're at. Are you at 3%? Are you at 6%? For those companies that answered the poll question that your savings are increasing, are you going from 2 to 3%, or are you going from 6 to 7%? That's the big difference here. I think there's definitely some room to improve for the rest of the world, these peer organizations, but with world class, we definitely see the savings that are able to drive decline. Some of the caveats here. Savings definitions matter. Reduction versus avoidance, right? We talked about avoidance, and the example that we used was an IT software provider increasing maintenance costs and being able to defend those off versus savings that you're negotiating as part of a purchase. And we do separate these out in a different, and look at it in a different way, but this is really a good way to look at it overall. Again, most mature organizations may experience the law of diminishing returns. So as you've really become very expert at this, world-class organizations have been able to really put some, extensive best practices and some core competencies in place for negotiation. You do hit a point where maybe you've driven, as much as you can in the existing categories. And so one of the key trends that we see is that procurement is looking to increase that influence we talked about so that they have a broader pool to potentially influence and drive savings out of. So in existing categories that are mature, there may not be the opportunity that there was before. So procurement is looking to take on new categories, things like services procurement and indirect services spend, project-based work, big system integrator type things. These are the areas that companies are looking at and thinking this is maybe the next generation of where we're going to find our savings. Pass it back to you, Richard.
Patrick, a quick question. Now, when you say total spend to sourceable spend, is that the spend the procurement has influenced?
This is the total spend. So spend that procurement has influenced, but also spend that they're not influencing. So this is a percentage of the total spend.
Of the total. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this is me again. So one of the metrics that we talk about is procurement ROI. So if you think about the previous slides that we talked about the cost of procurement. And in the previous slide, we just talked about cost savings, so savings that procurement is able to drive. Now, the ROI, or procurement ROI, is simply the ratio of the total cost savings to the cost of procurement. So in this example, you can see that top line represents world-class. The 9 in 2014, or 9x payback, represents the savings that are driven out of procurement are 9 times the cost of procurement itself. And so while we've talked about this idea of diminishing returns, and here it's very obvious when you think of it in terms of world-class ROI. You can see that during the 2010, 11, and 12 time frame, it was rising pretty significantly, this ratio of cost to savings, and now it's started to decline again. But still, we're looking at a 9x payback for world-class companies who have really invested in the efficiency and effectiveness area. The rest of the world is in this 3 to 4 range of payback to cost. And so again, this is a higher level way of looking at cost and savings together. Now, one of the things that we'll start to talk about here is this idea that while cost is important to track, while savings are important to track, as these things start to diminish, what are some of the other areas that we can focus on? Because really, this ROI, it doesn't include things like innovation. It doesn't include things like really, continuous improvement or, pushing to the next threshold. It doesn't include things like whether procurement is considered a trusted advisor or not. It really just simply looks at savings and cost. And so I think once you've built these foundational elements, we're going to go on to talk about some metrics that are really important to look at above and beyond just the basics.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to segue now into our metric number 7 that looks at how supply management resources are allocated. So as I alluded to earlier, are the right people doing the right things? And this is the case. We've actually shared a number of different kind of representative metrics, and it may take this kind of holistic view to really determine if you've got the right people in the right places. But one of the starting points would be to simply look at demarcating the organizational resources between strategic and operational activities. So the strategic being more involved in the long-range sourcing, strategic sourcing and category management activities that help the business meet core objectives, and operational being primarily in the day-to-day procedural or transactional activity. And if you look at this intuitively, I think the desired state would be to allocate the majority of resources to the strategic activities supporting business objectives, but looking at current benchmark data, the inverse is actually more often the case. So roughly a 60 to 40 operational to strategic split on average. Now, some of the other things to look at, here's the Hackett benchmark on FTEs per 1 billion in spend. So this will be useful in right-sizing staffing levels based on the magnitude of the challenge. And here, world-class organizations apply about 44 FTEs per billion in spend, versus the peer group overall, about 27% fewer resources. So that's a productivity measure. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to supply risk management, more resources rather than fewer is actually the desired state. So here the top quartile align 13 full-time equivalents to measuring and mitigating supply risk as compared to just 2 at the bottom end of the spectrum. So from supplier management, from a technology standpoint, supplier management tools for onboarding and maintaining supplier capability and risk profiles and certifications, along with supplier performance measurement tools to scorecard supplier performance, especially for the most strategic suppliers, is certainly a key enabling technology. But one of the caveats here is that to affect change and allocate resources away from tactical more towards strategic is really going to require a full source-to-pay automation, because that's going to be the driver to allow you to reallocate resources to spend less time on more manual or transactional activities. And it also may require a skill set mix change as you move away from operational or tactical into the more strategic activities. And Patrick, continuing on in the supplier management vein, maybe you can share with us some of the benchmarks around how supplier management personnel, FTEs, are managing spend on a per $1 billion spend basis, or metric number 8.
Sure. I'll talk about that. And, around the previous metric, we did include that metric around supplier risk management. And I have to say this is an area where, we're getting a tremendous amount of interest and attention, and we just did a lot of research around it. And, that previous metric showed about 4.5 on average companies that, or FTEs that are really actively involved in this process. And, these tend to be the big financial services companies. These tend to be the healthcare companies. But I think it's an area where, we're getting a lot of interest, and that's the type of example where people are looking to move resources off of some of the basic transactional things around order management and requisition creation and really get them focused on things that are going to drive bottom line value and protect the company from risk. That's an example of where we're really shifting the role of procurement from this idea of a transaction center to a group that is really actively protecting the business and providing business insights. And so that's a big reason why I wanted to call out that metric. Now, when it comes to suppliers per billion in spend, I think this is one of those metrics that we always get a really interesting debate around, because our data shows that world-class companies have less suppliers. That, essentially by having a lower number of suppliers, they have a lower operating cost model. They're able to take a smaller group of suppliers and extract more value out of them, work more strategically with them. But what we've seen also here is that while this is a really good benchmark to say, okay, where are we at here and where do we need to go, once this consolidation has happened, there is a trend where companies are looking at this and saying, do we need to actually increase the number of suppliers that we have? Do we need to expand the pool so we have access to better solutions, different solutions, potentially drive innovation, drive competition? So I think it's important as you look at suppliers per billion in spend that you have, it's important to initially consolidate, to get the duplicates out of there, to get the duplicates out of the system, to save time and energy and make sure the information is accurate and make sure you have catalogs that are accessible and easy to understand and use. But once that hard work is done, once you've rationalized the supply base, it is important to take a look again and say, have we done too much? Or are there areas where we should expand our supply base again to really open up and make sure that we're seeing the full picture and that if there's innovative opportunities out there to take advantage of? And so, again, that's kind of the caveat here, where it's important to use this metric as a start. Make sure that you are looking to consolidate just from an overall work perspective, the number of suppliers that you have to actively manage and cleanse data around and onboard and train. But ultimately, you do want to, at some point, take a look at this and say, should we expand this pool? So that's what this metric is all about, and it's a metric that we get asked about quite a bit, and you can see some of the data here from 2013, 2014. We break it into direct and indirect so the companies can see what the difference is in our benchmark. Richard? Okay. This is all around supplier innovation. And so I mentioned earlier this idea of moving from just a cost and savings focused world. And this is a very difficult question, though. How do you measure supplier innovation? Well, a lot of times what we're seeing is that companies are measuring everything across the life cycle when it comes to a new idea. So the companies that do this right, that are able to drive supplier innovation, treat the innovation life cycle in a formal way. When a new idea is submitted or captured, they track that. And then they track it through the vetting process. They track to see if it was productized and if it actually had an impact on the business. They also look to finance to say, is what we're claiming, this impact, is it actually real? Can we sign off on this? And so companies that have done that are able to go and say that they've been able to drive incremental revenue from supplier innovation to the tune of 3.5% on average here for the companies that are actually able to track it. Now, I think that's an important differentiation when it comes to this metric, that this isn't all companies. This is a company that is invested in the ability to track innovation throughout its life cycle, to track the submission of new ideas, through to whether they were productized or became a service, and understand and get sign-off from finance what that impact was. And so we see a lot of procurement organizations really focusing on how can they formalize that process and make it something different than continuous improvement. This isn't just a small idea to potentially reduce costs. This is having a supplier showcase, having suppliers come in and show you and solve a problem that you've submitted to them, new ideas that you then take and you move forward. And you have internal venture capital money to do that, to dedicate to these new ideas. And so it's much bigger than just continuous improvement. And the CPOs that we talk to really like to make that point, that innovation is something game-changing for them. So we wanted to talk about that incremental revenue from supplier innovation and the steps that are involved to track that, because that's something we see as becoming increasingly important to drive new value.
Thanks, Patrick. And that's one of these emerging metrics, the ones that kind of hit our charts with a bullet, as we said, in which we expect to actually move up the ranking in the order of importance. And the last one on our list fits that camp as well, one that's gaining a lot more traction and credence in the market is this concept of a net promoter score. And while we've been emphasizing with the other 9 metrics of the top 10 the importance of kind of external benchmarking, comparing to the overall market, world-class performance, industry, peers, those kinds of things, this one is certainly a more inwardly focused measure, and we think it's critical because if you look at doing everything right, in spite of that, if internal customers aren't aware of or don't acknowledge the value being contributed by procurement, that can all go for naught. So this one we view as really critical. The other thing I'd mention here is that while we've chosen not to highlight in particular kind of process metrics like cycle times around days to complete direct to PO process or transaction volumes, those kinds of things, we think this kind of measure encapsulates a lot of that. So if your customer satisfaction is high, the internal customer satisfaction, that's going to be a proxy of how easy to use your underlying processes are. Do they meet the needs of business users? And if budget owners see the value in engaging the procurement function in their initiatives. So this net promoter score, as I said, is gaining more and more traction in the marketplace. As with most customer satisfaction metrics, it's fundamentally a survey tool wherein the respondents would rate their overall satisfaction on a scale of 0 or 1 to 10, and evaluating those responses, 1 through 6 would be viewed as detractors, a 7 or 8 would be passive, and a 9 or 10 would be a promoter, a real proponent. And then the net promoter score essentially throws out the ones that are neutral or passive, and is the percentage of promoters minus the percentage of detractors. So, for example, if you had a survey of 100 respondents, half are neutral, but promoters outnumber detractors 30 to 20, your net promoter score is 10%. Of course, heaven forbid, you could have a net detractor score, perhaps, if they outnumbered the promoters. Technology standpoint, this can be as simple as a Survey Monkey type tool that gets these responses, but the key here, and some of the caveats here, is that it be performed as an ongoing trend analysis, and that underlying root cause analysis would be required to really address any unfavorable scores that may come up as you go along. So that completes our top 10, and Dawn, we wanted to have one more poll question that I'll get to in a second. First, I'm actually going to show you just kind of a glimpse of how these top 10 could come together in various CPO dashboards organized around the area of focus. So I won't dwell on these, but kind of real quickly, a spend management dashboard that looks at both spend under management, the spend line item visibility, and procurement contract compliance metrics together, followed by a procurement operations dashboard. So how am I doing both in terms of cost of procurement, the savings, which represent the denominator and numerators of the procurement ROI calculation, as well as this net promoter score. And finally, kind of a supplier management dashboard. How am I allocating resources? Am I deriving supplier innovation from my strategic suppliers? And what does the consolidation or concentration of spend with fewer suppliers look like, and what opportunities does that present? So as I mentioned, we wanted to give you a chance to weigh in. We shared with you what we think our top 10 are. And Dawn, if you pose the question to our audience here to tell us what their number one metric would be.
Absolutely. And folks, we do know that we have about 20 questions in queue, and we will not be able to get to all of them, but we will make sure that our presenters get to them. But I wanted them to get through these amazing slides. So which of the following is the number one metric that matters most to your organization? Is it A, percentage of suppliers accounting for 80% of the total spend? B, cost of procurement as a percent of spend? C, incremental revenue from supplier innovation? D, your net promoter score? E, procurement contract compliance? F, procurement ROI? G, realize implemented savings. H, spend under management. I, spend with line item visibility. Or J, supply management resource allocations. If you can click on one and only one and hit submit, that would be great. So, I don't even know where to start with these questions because we have so many, which means people were so engaged and reading your slides so well. So what I'm going to ask our presenters to do is to type up and respond to each of these questions. And then Snehal from Sourcing Interest Group will make sure that you get a set of answers for everybody that participated today. And I'm sorry for those of you that are going to be coming in and listening to the recorded webinar. This will be out for 3 years for download and replay. What we can try and do is get the questions and answers typed in for you. So if you send the link to other people and say, so great, what a great webinar, I want to make sure that they get access to the questions and answers as well. So 45% said G. It's still realized implemented savings. How about that? Followed up by 16% procurement ROI, 14% spend under management. And then we go down from there. What's your thought on that?
Well, I'm not surprised at all, Dawn. Procurement is all about savings, right? I mean, that's ultimately procurement's role. I think if I was to look at this, the way I would approach it is maybe you have an overall scorecard, and savings has a weighting of 45, 50% in that scorecard, right? And then you incorporate these other metrics, and they have a lower weighting. I think that's the key, is to track these things together. But I'm not surprised. I mean, this is what procurement's mandate is all about.
Mm-hmm. And Richard?
Yeah, I'd agree. Not a surprise. At the end of the day, procurement's always going to be measured on savings. But I think that holistic view that balances these other metrics as well is kind of the way we see this emerging.
Okay,
so just wanted to...
I'm sorry. I just wanted you to talk about this. The download link right here is for a white paper called Analyze This. And so, folks, we do want to make sure that you know this link is in the deck that we're going to push you. But I want to get to the next slide as well because I want people to know, say, if we could go to the next slide, the Horizon event is coming up. And the reason I'm excited about this is it's actually only a few miles away from where I live. Beautiful Amelia Island at the Ritz-Carlton. Horizon is Zycus' premier annual event. It's November 9th, 10th, and 11th. And I went last year. Let me tell you, they feed you well. They give you fabulous entertainment. They're going to have a beach party that evening, one evening there. They're going to have amazing keynote speakers. So if you have the opportunity, I'd love to invite you to our island. I'd love to see you at the Zycus Horizon event. And I get to speak at it, too. So I get to talk to all of you if you show up. And then, if you can go to the next slide for me, I would really appreciate it. I want you guys to click on the file transfer box that is showing up on your screen right now. If you do so, this will be downloaded to your hard drive. From your hard drive, you will have access to both of our presenters. Their contact information is on this last slide. You'll have all the content that we spoke of today. So I just want to make sure that I get through all those housekeeping items before we get to the top of the hour, and I have to excuse everybody to go back to their other jobs. So do you guys want to answer a couple questions for the 2 minutes we have left, or do you have any closing comments?
Be happy to answer any questions.
Yep.
Okay. This one is always tricky, but when you talk about savings, do you have general guidelines on how to track savings?
Yeah, I think we tried to highlight, the key here being tracking all the way through to actual and realized savings. So, really being able to, and it requires data. It requires analytics and insight, meaning you got to be able to get at the actual invoices that get paid, being able to track those to the contracts to determine that the actual contracted savings were implemented and realized, and being able to really compare the current price paid on that invoice versus, typically it's a year-over-year comparison. What was that in the last in the last reporting period according to the contract? And really, that's what's needed to pass muster with the finance folks who really often need to sign off to validate these savings.
Good. So then when we talk about savings, and you talked about net savings, when you talk about net savings, is that net of any increases in other contracts, or is that only the ones that went down in price or overall total cost? Excuse me.
Yeah, Patrick, I think that's where we get into this debate sometimes about cost reduction versus cost avoidance. And that varies by organization as to whether they'll acknowledge the cost avoidance. A lot of your controllers may have issue with that.
Right. So we showed the overall number in this presentation that includes both savings and avoidance. We break it out in some of our other material so the companies can understand and potentially benchmark it separately. But we like to track both.
You like to track both?
Yes.
Okay, so you guys, it is top of the hour. I do always try and honor the 1 hour time limit. Gentlemen, we are going to be sending your homework. You've got about, I think, 17 questions that we didn't get to. And I can't thank you enough. Richard, I want to thank you and Zycus and Rohan, who hasn't been speaking, but behind the scenes for bringing us a great presentation. And always, Patrick, Hackett Group, great benchmarks, great comments. We love having you guys here as well. Both wonderful, fabulous members of Sourcing Interest Group, and both of them are scheduled to present at our Global Summit in October in Denver. So I hope to see you guys all there. And make sure if you come to me, I'll point out these two guys in the crowd, and you can make sure to carry on the conversation. And then maybe I'll see you on Amelia Island at the Zycus Horizon event as well. So with that, we're going to sign off, and I hope to see everybody next week in our webinar. We have a great one with A.T. Kearney. And then the following week, we have a deep dive. So if you really want to learn more about Zycus, and I know you do after today, we're going to do a deep dive into their solution set. What actually is Zycus as a company? What do they do? How do they do it? And why are they so great? So join us in 2 weeks for that as well. So with that, go to sig.org and start signing up. You're going to be getting membership loyalty points for everything you do, and I'd love to see you online really soon again. So Patrick and Richard, have a great day, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.